It was a typical Friday night in the city. The streets were buzzing with activity as people spilled out of bars and clubs, desperately trying to cling to the last remnants of the weekend. I navigated my trusty old taxi through the chaos, my eyes scanning the throngs of drunken revelers for any potential fares. Being a cab driver in this town wasn't the most glamorous job, but it paid the bills. And to be honest, I kind of enjoyed the thrill of the chase, weaving through traffic and picking up random strangers. You never knew what kind of interesting characters you'd end up with in the back seat. Sometimes it was stuffy executives, other times it was giggling college kids. Occasionally I'd even get the odd serial killer, just kidding, kind of. On this particular night, business was slow. I cruised up and down the main strip, watching as group after group of clubgoers stumbled towards Ubers and lifts. I was starting to think I might have to call it a night when I spotted a lone figure standing on the corner, shivering in the cold. Bingo. I pulled up alongside them and rolled down the window. "Need a ride, pal?" The person turned towards me, and I got my first good look at them. It was a man, probably in his late 30s or early 40s. He had a scruffy beard and dishevelled hair, and he was wearing a tattered overcoat that looked like it had seen better days. "Yeah, actually," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Thanks." He opened the door and slid into the back seat, slamming it behind him. "Where to?" I asked, glancing at him through the rearview mirror. He hesitated for a moment, then rattled off an address on the other side of town. "And, can you step on it? I'm kind of in a hurry." I raised an eyebrow but didn't ask any questions. "You got it." But as I drove away, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had settled in the pit of my stomach. There was something about that guy, the pure terror in his eyes, the way he'd practically fled from the car, that just didn't sit right with me. Against my better judgment, I found myself slowing down, glancing back towards the apartment building. I should just move on, I told myself. It's none of my business. But for some reason, I couldn't. There was a voice in the back of my mind, nagging at me, telling me that I needed to go back, that I needed to check on him. With a sigh, I made a U-turn and pulled up in front of the building again. I hesitated for a moment, then turned off the engine and got out of the car. I crossed the street, my footsteps echoing in the eerily quiet night, and made my way towards the entrance. The lobby was dimly lit and deserted, save for a lone security guard sitting behind a battered desk, his eyes glued to a small TV screen. He looked up as I approached. "Can I help you, sir?" Yeah," I said, trying to sound casual. "I just dropped off a fare a minute ago, and I wanted to make sure he made it inside okay." The guard narrowed his eyes suspiciously. "You a cop or something?" "What? No, nothing like that," I said quickly. "I'm just a concerned cab driver. That's all." He studied me for a moment, then shrugged. "Well, I didn't see anyone come in, but I've been a bit preoccupied." He gestured towards the TV, which was showing some kind of crime drama. I nodded, trying not to let my growing unease show. "Okay, thanks." What I saw made my blood run cold. The bed was a mess, the sheets tangled and stained with what looked like blood. And there in the corner of the room was a dark figure, curled up on the floor. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The figure shifted slightly, and I realized with a jolt that it was the stranger from the cab. "Hey, are you okay?" I called out, my voice trembling slightly. The figure turned towards me, and I recoiled in horror. It was the stranger, all right, but his face was a bloody, mangled mess. His eyes were sunken and wild, and his mouth was twisted into a grotesque, pained grimace. "Get out!" he rasped, his voice barely audible. I didn't need to be told twice. I turned and fled, my heart pounding in my ears. I burst out of the apartment and raced down the stairs, barely registering the startled shouts of the security guard as I ran past him. I was just about to take a sip of my steaming hot brew when a familiar figure caught my eye. My breath caught in my throat as I recognized the tattered overcoat and dishevelled appearance of the stranger from earlier. He was hurrying down the sidewalk, glancing nervously over his shoulder as he went. Without thinking, I jumped up from my seat and dashed out the door, barely registering the confused shout of the waitress behind me. I burst onto the street, my eyes scanning the area for any sign of the stranger. There! I spotted him just a few blocks down, still moving at a frantic pace. I took off after him, my legs pumping furiously as I wove through the sparse late-night traffic. "Hey, wait!" I shouted, but the stranger didn't seem to hear me. He just kept running, his ragged coat flapping behind him. I dogged his heels, determined not to lose him this time. After a few blocks, he turned down a dark alley, and I followed, my heart pounding in my chest. As I rounded the corner, I came to a sudden, screeching halt. The alley was a dead end, a towering brick wall blocking my path. But there was no sign of the stranger. He'd just vanished. I stood there, panting, my eyes darting around in confusion. Where the hell had he gone? There was nowhere for him to hide. The alley was completely empty, save for a few overflowing dumpsters and a stray cat that hissed at me as I approached. I took a few tentative steps forward, my gaze sweeping the area. Had I imagined the whole thing? Was I just so rattled by what I'd seen earlier that I was starting to lose my mind? Just as I was about to turn and head back, a sudden movement caught my eye. I whirled around, my heart racing, and found myself staring into a pair of wild, terrified eyes. It was the stranger, crouched behind one of the dumpsters, his face a mask of pure panic. "What the hell are you doing?" I demanded, taking a step towards him. He recoiled, pressing himself back against the wall. "Stay away from me," he hissed, his voice barely above a whisper. I held up my hands, trying to appear non-threatening. "Hey man, it's okay, I just want to help. What's going on?" He shook his head frantically. "You don't understand, it's still out there, I have to hide." "What's out there?" I asked, my brow furrowing in confusion. "What are you running from?" The stranger opened his mouth to respond, but before he could get the words out, a low, guttural growl echoed from the shadows at the far end of the alley. We both froze, our eyes locked on the darkness. Slowly, a hulking figure began to emerge, its massive form silhouetted against the dim glow of the street lamps. I felt the blood drain from my face as I caught a glimpse of it, a towering, beast-like creature, its eyes gleaming with primal, predatory hunger. It let out another growl, deep and menacing, and began to stalk towards us. The stranger let out a strangled cry and scrambled backward, pressing himself as far into the corner as he could. I stood there, paralyzed with fear, my mind racing as I tried to figure out what the hell was happening. The creature closed in, its footsteps shaking the ground. I could feel the heat of its breath on the back of my neck, and I knew, with a sinking feeling, that there was nowhere for us to run. As it reared up, preparing to strike, I squeezed my eyes shut, bracing myself for the end, but the blow never came. Instead, I heard a thunderous crash, followed by a deafening roar of pain. I opened my eyes to find the creature reeling, a gaping wound in its side. It howled in agony and turned, lumbering back into the shadows from whence it came. I stood there, my heart pounding, trying to understand what had just happened. The stranger was curled up in a ball, shaking uncontrollably. I cautiously approached him, my legs trembling. "Hey man, are you okay?" He looked up at me, his eyes wild. "We have to get out of here," he whispered. "It's not over. It'll be back." I didn't need to be told twice. I grabbed his arm and hauled him to his feet, and together we stumbled out of the alley and back onto the main street. We ran for what felt like an eternity, putting as much distance between us and that thing as possible. Finally, we reached the diner, and I collapsed against the door, gasping for breath. The stranger leaned against the wall, his face ashen. "What the hell was that?" I demanded once I'd caught my breath. He shook his head, his eyes haunted. I don't know. All I know is that it's been hunting me for weeks. I thought I'd finally lost it, but..." He trailed off, shuddering. I stared at him, a million questions racing through my mind. But before I could ask any of them, a loud crash from the alley made us both jump. We spun around to see the creature emerging, its massive form silhouetted against the darkness. It let out another bone-chilling roar and began to lumber towards us. Without a moment's hesitation, I grabbed the stranger's arm and yanked him through the diner's doors, slamming them shut behind us. The waitress, who had been calmly refilling her coffee mug, let out a startled yelp. "Call the police!" I shouted, bracing myself against the door as the creature slammed into it, shaking the whole building. The waitress just stared at me, her eyes wide with fear. What is that thing?" "I don't know, but it's out there and it's trying to kill us," I yelled. "Now call the damn police!" She nodded frantically and grabbed the phone, her fingers trembling as she dialed the emergency number. I turned my attention back to the door, which was shuddering under the creature's relentless assault. The stranger was huddled in the corner, his face buried in his hands. I grabbed his shoulder, trying to get his attention. "Hey, we're not going to make it if you don't help me. What can we do?" He looked up at me, his eyes brimming with tears. "Nothing, there's nothing we can do. It's too strong, too fast. We're just dead." I stared at him, stunned by his defeatist attitude. "No way, man. We're not giving up that easily. There's got to be something we can do." He shook his head, his lips trembling. "You don't understand. This thing, it's not human. It's a monster, a nightmare come to life, and it won't stop until it's killed us both." I gritted my teeth, determined not to let this guy's hopelessness drag me down. "Well, I'm not going down without a fight. Now help me figure out how to stop this thing." The creature slammed into the door again, and I felt the hinges start to give way. I braced myself, ready to make my last stand. The door buckled under the next blow, splintering and cracking. The stranger's hopelessness was infectious, but I wasn't about to let it paralyze me. I scanned the diner, looking for anything that might serve as a weapon. "What's your name?" I asked him, my eyes still darting around the room. "Mark," he whispered, barely audible over the creature's roars. "Mark, grab anything you can use as a weapon. We need to slow it down." Mark nodded numbly, his eyes wide with fear, and started to look around as well. I spotted a heavy metal chair and hoisted it, testing its weight. Not great, but it would have to do. The door gave another agonizing screech as the creature pounded against it. I backed up, holding the chair like a makeshift shield. The waitress, still clutching the phone, looked at me with panic in her eyes. "The police are on their way," she stammered, "but they said it'll be at least 10 minutes. "We don't have 10 minutes, I muttered, just as the door finally gave way. The creature burst through, its massive form filling the entryway. Its eyes locked onto Mark, who was now brandishing a coffee pot, and it snarled, baring rows of sharp, glistening teeth. "Over here!" I shouted, hope to distract it. The creature's eyes flicked towards me and it growled, its attention momentarily diverted. I swung the chair with all my might, aiming for its head. The impact barely fazed it, but it did buy us a few precious seconds. "Mark, go!" I yelled, pointing towards the kitchen. Mark hesitated for a split second, then bolted towards the back. The creature lunged at me, its claws slicing through the air where I had been standing a moment before. I jumped back, swinging the chair again, trying to keep it at bay. The waitress had ducked behind the counter, peeking out with terror-filled eyes. "Get to the back!" I shouted at her. "Lock yourself in the freezer if you have to." The creature roared, clearly frustrated, and turned its attention back to me. I kept backing up, leading it away from the others. My heart pounded in my chest, fear and adrenaline coursing through my veins. "Come on, you ugly son of a..." I muttered, gripping the chair tightly. The creature snarled and charged, its speed taking me by surprise. I swung the chair again, but this time it caught the edge and sent it flying out of my hands. I stumbled back, trying to regain my footing, but the creature was on me in an instant. Its claws raked across my arm, and I cried out in pain. I kicked out, trying to push it away, but it was relentless. Just as it reared back for another strike, a loud crash echoed through the diner. Mark had thrown a metal tray at the creature, hitting it square in the head. The creature roared, more in anger than pain, and turned its attention to him. I took the opportunity to grab a nearby stool and swung it at the creature's legs, hoping to knock it off balance. The stool connected, and the creature stumbled, giving me a moment to scramble to my feet. Mark and I backed up together, inching towards the kitchen. The creature, now enraged, followed, its eyes glowing with a terrifying intensity. "Into the kitchen!" I shouted, and we both bolted through the door, slamming it shut behind us. I grabbed a metal rack and wedged it against the door, hoping it would hold. "We can't keep running," Mark panted, his face pale. "It's too fast." I nodded, glancing around the kitchen. We need to find something stronger, something that can actually hurt it. Mark's eyes widened as he spotted a large industrial meat cleaver hanging on the wall. He grabbed it and handed it to me. Here, this might work. I took the cleaver, feeling a grim determination settle over me. All right, let's see if we can take this thing down. The door shuddered as the creature slammed against it, but the metal rack held. For now. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. Mark, find something to use as a backup weapon, anything heavy or sharp. He nodded and started rummaging through the kitchen drawers. I positioned myself by the door, the cleaver gripped tightly in my hand. The creature's growls grew louder, more insistent. Come on, I muttered. Let's finish this. The door burst open, the metal rack clattering to the floor. The creature lunged through, its eyes blazing with fury. I swung the cleaver with all my strength, aiming for its neck. The blade connected, slicing through its thick hide. The creature howled in pain, but it wasn't enough to stop it. It swiped at me with its massive claws, and I barely dodged in time. Mark, armed with a large frying pan, swung at its head, landing a solid blow. The creature staggered, disoriented. I seized the opportunity and brought the cleaver down again, this time embedding it deep into its shoulder. The creature roared, thrashing wildly, and I was thrown back by the force of its movements. Mark and I pressed the attack, hitting it from both sides, trying to wear it down. Finally, with one last desperate swing, I drove the cleaver into the creature's skull. It let out a final, ear-piercing shriek, then collapsed to the ground, twitching. We stood there panting, staring at the lifeless body of the creature. The adrenaline slowly ebbed away, leaving us both shaking and exhausted. We did it, Mark said, his voice barely above a whisper. Yeah, I replied, my breath coming in ragged gasps. We slumped to the floor, the reality of what had just happened starting to sink in. The waitress peeked out from the freezer, her eyes wide with shock. Is it over? She asked, her voice trembling. I nodded, too exhausted to speak. She stepped out cautiously, looking at the creature's body with a mixture of horror and disbelief. As the sound of sirens finally reached us, I closed my eyes, relief washing over me. We had survived the nightmare, but I had a feeling that life would never be the same again.